a little chilly here, so I have my collar up, and I hope you all have something warm. We should be issued little flasks of brandy, I think. This is going to be a sort of a talk rather than a lecture. It'll have images, but I will not comment on very many of them since their presence here is for basically one reason. It's to show the people in them rather than the things that the people are standing in front of. At some point I may identify particular details and so on, but as you will see, my concern is the people who are in that space. I want to thank Max, and I want to thank Bronwyn, and I want to thank a lot of friends here who made it possible for me to come and also motivated me to come, in particular Ann Lewis and Peter Fay, who I've known for a long time. This is my third trip to Australia, and it is, again, to see friends in part, to see artists that I know. Christian Campura wasn't mentioned of the artists that were from Australia who was in my Biennale, but he was indeed in that Biennale, along with Sean Gladwell and Rosemary Lang, and I saw him yesterday and hope to see him again today. It is also, of course, to see the fair, which is my first time, and to see the Sydney Biennial, which is my third. In 2000, I was invited to join the curatorial team, which was made up to sort of prepare the ground for that show, which consisted of the late Harry Zeman, of Nick Sirota from the Tate, of Fumio Nanjo from Tokyo, of Hetty Perkins from here, and for a while of Louise Neri. That group was convened by Nick Waterlow, who was an incredible curator, who was an incredible curator and who did a great deal for making Australian art known outside of Australia, but who was very good as a welcomer to these places. And his loss is a considerable one for all in the profession and for all of the people who sit on the different sides of the equation across the Pacific and Atlantic and a few other oceans thrown in. The slide you're looking at right now is, in a sense, a surrogate for a picture of Nick, which I don't have, although there's a very good issue of Art Australia, which has a lot about him. What you're seeing, actually, is an image of Sigmar Polke, who also died recently, standing behind one of his paintings. I think it's Arthur Kessler who talked about the ghost in the machine. Polke was notable for making pictures, not machines, machines being, of course, a term used for a certain kind of pompous picture of the 19th century, for making fantastic pictures. And in all paintings, sooner or later, you will find such ghosts. It is a great subject of critical debate, how much importance you give to them, whether the ghost's intentions matter, whether the human presence in the painting is what gives it value, or whether some social presence or some other factor is at issue. But the fact is, whether or not you believe that the social or the formal or the whatever it is, it takes precedence, there are always people who make art, and it's something that gets forgotten a good deal. This is people looking at Louise Bourgeois' work at that Biennale. Louise worked, Sigmar died very prematurely. Louise worked up until her 98th year, and in fact worked the day before her death. And this is a very instructive story for lots of people who feel left out of the art scramble, because to all intents and purposes, Louise's public career, the great fame that she now has, didn't begin until she was in her 70s and didn't begin until 1980. Up until that point, she'd been bobbing along, often underwater, in terms of her career, making things all the time, but never exactly getting her due. And Louise is a good example of how sheer cussedness, and of course prodigious imagination, actually does win out in the end. And there are many examples of this that we too easily forget when people with prodigious amounts of support and no imagination get so much attention. Now, thinking about Nick Waterlow, here was a man who lived in several worlds, who saw the fast lane and the slower lanes, but who had this amazing kind of avidity, which incidentally is something that Baudelaire identified as the prime characteristic of the modern sensibility, the flaneur that he hypothesized in the 19th century as being the essential modern personality, the sort of meandering person, the person who wanders around the world and takes note of things. He identified as having the avidity of a child and the will of an adult. It's something that I'll come back to, but certainly Nick had both of those things. And he had a wonderful lack of cynicism and at the same time a great deal of sophistication. We too easily forget these days that cynicism is not sophistication. It is actually a mask for a lack of courage in the face of the kinds of complex consciousness sophistication require of us. People who are cynical in passive terms, and if you want to footnote these things, you can check with Peter Sloterdijk, A Critique of Cynical Reason. People who are cynical in the passive way are the people who simply take what we all know about the contradictions and insincerities of the world and codify them in ways that allow them to step out of any actual engagement with them that might otherwise change the way we look at the world and somewhat allay our suspicions that everything is all a fraud. Nick had that ability, and he was an advocate for art that he thought made a difference. And indeed it did, and his advocacy did as well. These are qualities that we should not take at all for granted these days. Jadedness seems to be the flavor of the month or the year or the decade. I'm not sure which exactly. And there's more than ever talk about the business of art and less talk about art itself. We hear over and over again about who bought something, or who owned it, or who sloughed it off and passed it along to the next sucker in order to make a mark and recapitalize their enterprise. Now, I say this, and you may think I'm simply making fun of people who buy and sell art. I'm not at all, and you will see that I'm not. But in fact, there is a great deal of this kind of thing going on because the speculation in art is carried on by people who have no interest in it whatsoever, other than the fact that it allows for speculation. And does it ever? However, the people who collect art at the high level, spending millions, tens of millions, maybe even billions of dollars on art, are a very different breed. So don't look at the kind of suit somebody wears, or the dress they wear, or the checkbook that they have, or the address that they have as a gallery. Look at how they behave in relation to the things that get circulated through the market. Look at the ways in which those things do or do not end up in public institutions. Think about what great intelligence and great wealth can do sometimes to build cultural scenes, rather than, again, taking the easy, cynical attitude, which simply looks at the froth on the top of the art market and concludes from that that everything below that froth is polluted. Now, you would think that a current economic crisis would be the time to take a pause. And to rethink things. But as we can already tell, and thank God the recession does show some signs of easing, it's less severe here than it is in the States. Of course, we did stupider things in the States, so that's why we're in such trouble. But in any case, as we set the reset button in this context, we find that we're right in the middle of where we were, except we are now on fast forward and not at the usual pace, and that the signs of excess and continuing excess are all around us. I would say parenthetically that it is not just a matter of the buying and selling of art. It is a matter of everything that goes with the consumption in all forms, and that includes not just the commodity, cash, commerce department, but also the markets for new ideas. And new ideas, of course, have markets. And some of those markets like to pretend that they're not markets. They like to pretend that they're, in fact, entirely above the fray and disinterested. But the speculation, and as long as we have this term available to us, the hedging of ideas over the last 30 years in the market of theory has been every bit as absurd as what went on in the markets of the exchanges of goods. This is, by the way, the painting that Polka was hiding behind. And it was in a room full of paintings. And so imagine that these people standing in front of this picture are looking, in a sense, at his ghost, even though he's not there. And this is the same painting viewed from a corridor where a mural done by Donald Diliodita, a Nigerian-American artist, painted his own kind of mural painting in a spot which is not so similar from where we are now. The building in which the Italian pavilion was formerly housed, in which the Biennale was centered, was an exhibition building of the same generation as this, or the same generation as the exhibition building where the art fair occurs, and there were paintings like this underneath the walls on which he painted. So you have here a conversation, if you will, between two types of public decoration, that of the 21st century and that of the 19th. Scratch the surface of the 21st century, as I will do, and you will find the 19th and the 18th underneath it. And part of my skepticism about many things that are currently said, apocalyptic, dystopian kinds of things that are said about the world as we live in it, is that they sound exactly like the things that were said in the 19th and 18th century, which is not to say there are no changes, but just to say that the end of the world doesn't just come because one finds the perfect rhetorical formulation to predict it. And in the meantime, much happens that is much more important and much more lasting than the conversation about absolutes. In any case, just turn the page here. The critique of institutions, which was undertaken starting sometime in the 1970s, has produced an enormous body of theoretical intellectual discourse, which is very, very, very interesting, very important, truly challenging. The problem is that it is often purveyed in language which is truly opaque, not meant for anybody actually to read, and it is completely disengaged from the actual politics of art. People who do not get down into the fray of institutional building and institutional change, but talk about institutional critique from a safe distance from all the pertinent and uncomfortable facts, have created no small amount of mischief in the current climate. And as a lapsed Marxist, I thought I should come in here and sing in the International. As a lapsed Marxist, I take this seriously because it seems to me that if my generation, the generation of 68, failed at many things, we nonetheless did learn a good deal in the process, and I'm dismayed that younger generations who talk politics, who talk Marxism, don't actually do politics. Very seldom anyway. In any case, the critique of institutions should include a critique of the institutions of critique. That is to say, publishing houses, universities, and all those places where degrees, jobs, preferences, publishing opportunities are passed out. Because in fact, we are facing a situation where an awful lot of the dissent that is out there in the art world and in art itself is shut out because it does not accord with particular prescribed discourses, certain prescribed ways in which you can dissent. And if you can't dissent in any old way it occurs to you to dissent and to throw your ideas into an open forum where they actually get debated, what you have is two kinds of conservatism. You have the conservatism of people who don't want to hear anything that's negative or critical, and those people who only like criticism that makes them more comfortable in their position. And we have a lot of that these days. Now, let me just catch up with where I was. The kind of phenomenon that I'm alluding to, and let me just get some more pictures for you, since that might be a distraction. This is Nalini Madani, who is an artist from Mumbai, whose studio actually is right next to the Taj Hotel, or very near to the Taj Hotel, where the famous terrorist incident took place some years ago. And this is a case of the wonderful sort of porousness of artistic discourse and the wonderful ways in which difference actually works, as opposed to theoretical discussions of difference that never get down to cases. This is a case of an artist who is working in a mode very similar to two artists who are also in this exhibition, and their presence in this exhibition was not accidental. Sigmar Polke is one, and Nancy Spiro is another. And how it is that an artist working in a different context in a different generation can take some of the same possibilities and come up with a very different, very vital art. The nature of art is not about simply one person identified with a style or a method becoming the be-all and end-all of that style or method, but rather about the plurality of uses to which certain basic ideas can be put. And as those works are put into those plurality of uses, real differences, subtle differences, the ones that matter, show up and give us something we would not otherwise have. So what Nalini Madani does with transparency, superposition, and the deliberate mixing of cultural codes, things that Nancy Spiro and Sigmar Polke, believe it or not, are both engaged in, gives us something that neither of them did. And by the way, neither Sigmar Polke or Nancy Spiro were the same either. Anyway, back to where I was. The sense that we have lived through a period of enormous excess and are dealing with the consequences, but not dealing with them very well since we are headed into probably another period of enormous excess, is something we must contend with, and I think increasingly younger artists will be contending with. It is, however, an old problem. It is not a new problem. The fact that it needs new solutions is what's significant. The fact that it occurs is perhaps less surprising to some than it might otherwise be. One of the great documents of disillusionment in this department is a poem by Arthur Rambo that comes from his book A Season in Hell. Rambo belonged as a prodigy to the symbolist poets in France in the period after the Paris Commune. In other words, in another period of sort of disillusionment with political engagement with art and of a kind of euphoric engagement with an aesthetic idea that seemed to trump everything. And Rambo did it better than anybody. And Rambo was a monster, an absolute monster, kind of wonderful monster. And he wrote a series of poems called A Season in Hell when he began to be disillusioned with his disillusionment, so to speak, and when he began to turn against his aesthetic utopia and reconsider his options. There's a poem called Adieu, which is farewell, which he wrote, and I will just read you a very, very small portion of it, but just to give you some sense that there are things we can sort of pull from the background and use now that might be helpful. He writes, I tried to invent all flowers, also planets, also new flesh, also new languages. I thought I had acquired a supernatural power. I called myself a magician, an angel, an angel free from all moral constraint. I went back, but I must go back to the soil to seek a new obligation to wrap myself in reality. Now, if you think about the discourses of the 1980s, in which it was said basically that because of what we have learned of linguistics, that almost no term had a correlative in the world to which one was in any way responsible, it was simply the way in which language operated that should call our attention, it's useful to reread Rambo. And it's useful also, of course, to read the skepticism of Roland Barthes and others who saw the perversion of their ideas become a huge problem for others. By the way, as I said, Rambo was a person who lived in a period of disillusionment, a double period of disillusionment, since it was after the Commune of 1871 in Paris, as well as being in the midst of the moment of the avant-garde in France, when he could see that the art for art's sake movement, the Parnassians to which he belonged briefly, were also problematic. Belonging to movements is a dangerous thing. Studying them carefully is a useful thing. Anyway, it is, as I said, a time to take stock and to think about the various and sundry possibilities that are available to us and the ways in which, I wish there was a light here, this is kind of hard to read, move it over here, and the ways in which we can learn from that past. If I've used these motifs from modernism, it's because I am a skeptic about the term postmodernism. The postness of postmodernism was entirely premature. I defy anybody to give me a date at which modernism was over. I defy them to find anybody else who speaks of postmodernism who will actually agree with their date. The problem with postmodernism is what we're really talking about is a series of internal crises within modernism and the recognition that modernism is a long period in human history. It is a period that begins late in the Renaissance. It does not begin at 1840 or 1900 or at any such date. And that the development of what we think of as modern art is a progress over a long time, what Fernand Braudel, the French philosopher and historian, would talk long duration. It's a long period of time, and there's every reason to look closely at the details of any particular pattern, but you get into a hell of a lot of trouble when you try to sort of, compress history and come up with the comfort of quick conclusions and punctuations. Making differences in meaning between times and cultures is all of what art is about in some respects, but collapsing cultures theoretically and then trying to reopen them after the fact is the dilemma in which postmodernism has found itself. Not learning history, or forgetting it, is no help at all, and quoting things from the past in style without regard to their substance is also extremely perilous. Let me look at another motif, and this is the motif that is in fact implicit in all of these slides. I'll give you some more. This is Nancy Spiro, who I just referred to. This is Ellsworth Kelly. And that is the crowd. Baudelaire's idea of the crowd is absolutely central to all that we know about modernism, and particularly about the relation of modern art to the public. Baudelaire was the first great modern art critic. He wrote a series of commentaries on the salons and on exhibitions, as well as a series of extended essays on individual artists, which are a model for virtually everybody that I know who writes serious art criticism, despite all of our other differences. He had a love-hate relationship with that crowd, as he did a love-hate relationship, or in some cases just a hate-hate relationship, with certain elements of that crowd. The first essay that he wrote in his salons was addressed to the bourgeois, and it is not a gentle address. He basically said, I write for you because you have power. I write for you also, of course, because in claiming your power, you have taken it away from the former aristocracies of taste who were also the bane of art's existence. And therefore, I respect that you have power. The question is, what will you do with that power, and will you learn how to use it? Will you become, in fact, as sophisticated in art as you are sophisticated in finance and economy? And that is a challenge that, again, remains a principal challenge of modern art and of modern art criticism ever since. And I would add to that then the building of institutions, the uses of institutions like museums and so on. The dilemma of the relationship of those who are committed to the activity in relation to those who have specific kinds of economic and financial and political power is the dilemma that everybody on every part of that dilemma have to work out. Over and over and over, people have to renegotiate their specific relations to specific people who share with them perhaps only one thing, and that is an interest in and commitment to certain kinds of art. I jokingly say that some of my best friends are billionaires. It's true, actually. They don't think at all what I think in politics, but we care very much about some of the same artists. Working in a mixed economy, so to speak, of culture is a matter of negotiating ways in which people who have that commitment can do something that would otherwise not happen at all. And you can't do it if you are utterly cynical about the people to whom you are talking. I would say, for instance, one of the people who is a billionaire, won't name names, who was the most influential in my relations with the modern, was somebody whose children, two of whose children are gay, and who gave to AIDS causes long before anybody in her social group gave to AIDS causes, and who would speak to AIDS causes long before anybody in her social group would speak to AIDS causes. Now, also, by the way, she has one of her daughters has a African-American lover, and she therefore has African-American grandchildren. And she also acted incredibly well in terms of supporting African-American artists, collecting them, giving them to the museum, and so on and so forth. So if one takes the sort of snotty attitude towards such people, reverse snobism of the people who have not, to assume that everybody who has not has good politics and everybody who has don't, then suddenly you disown what is perhaps your best ally in accomplishing things that, in fact, do need to be accomplished. Anyway, back to Baudelaire. Baudelaire had no such sort of institutional-minded orientation. He was a resenter by nature and a person with deep streaks of social discomfort and disease, but he was so bloody articulate. And he put them out there in ways that remain very useful to us. Daumier had a gentler view of the same thing. He also was interested in the crowd. Now, let me read to you just basically something that Baudelaire wrote about the crowds, not when addressing them as his uncomfortable allies in the cultural enterprise of the salon, but rather when he saw the crowd as his medium. He wrote in a poem that belonged to his poems, "It is not given to every man to take a bath in the multitude. Enjoying a crowd is an art. Multitude and solitude, identical terms, and interchangeable ones by the active and fertile poet. The man who is unable to people solitude is equally the man who is unable is equally the man unable to be alone in a bustling crowd. The dialectic of the mass audience and the solitary viewer, of a kind of pure dispensation towards art and of a pure focus on art, is not the counter-term to crowds. And people who wish that the museums would empty out, and who wishes that art fairs would go away, and who wishes that the attendance at the biennales would simply disappear, are exactly the kind of people that he describes. They want one thing at the cost of everybody else as being a member of that crowd, and the truth be told, they would not be able to survive in any other circumstance themselves. In other words, he's saying, people who don't know how to deal with crowds and find their own solitude and their own focus lack imagination. They are not poets. They just think they are, and they just think if the world would go away, they'd be more poetic. Now, understanding the crowd, therefore, becomes a crucial aspect of what all of us do. Before we worry about whether they understand art, we have to think about whether we understand them. The crowd, by the way, is not an inchoate mass. That is a convenience for sociologists and for ideologues. It is not an abstraction, a capital S subject of history that seems to move through history as if it was already constituted by history. By the way, history doesn't happen with a capital H either. People do it. And if there are large forces and long durations, there are nonetheless factors that are identifiable in situation after situation that do make a considerable difference in what the consequences are. Therefore, if one thinks of the crowd as made up of a group of self-selecting individuals that come together for disparate, sometimes overlapping, frequently conflicting purposes, this is Rainer Gonal, by the way, right next to Ellsworth Kelly. Ellsworth Kelly representing the kind of transcendental view of abstraction, unencumbered by the world. Rainer Gonal saying in about a dozen different languages, heavily accented, I am not a terrorist. We could extend this to all kinds of questions of immigration in my country and in this country, because the term terrorist, of course, is a convenient way to express fear of the other. In any case, there are many publics. And I haven't quoted him here, but I could easily throw him in. Another favorite poet in this regard is Walt Whitman, who was the great American poet of the multitude and who himself said, I am a multitude, which extends it further. It is not that you are the unique, totally integrated being surrounded by variety. You are variety yourself. And you are in a various situation, and the degree to which you are able to identify with those things which are both you and not you is an indication, again, of how broad one's imagination is. Now, given that the crowd is the condition of modern art, and again, just in simple historical terms, remember that the salons that Baudelaire wrote about were invented by the French Academy in the 17th century, actually the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and that audiences for salon exhibitions under the original Academy grew to 30,000 or more, and published catalogs that were published in thousands of examples rather than just a few. So the image that we have that this sort of mass event of the exhibition is new is simply a function of historical ignorance. Mass exhibitions have had it for a long time, and big crowds have attended them. Again, I instruct you to go to Daumier if you want to see the cheerful version of it. He has wonderful pictures of people snoring in exhibitions, people looking at themselves on the walls in exhibitions because they paid for the portrait that's up there, people looking at each other's dresses at exhibitions. All of the follies of the crowd are readily apparent in Daumier, and rather than wringing one's hands about them and thinking that we are on the end of the line in terms of cultural possibilities, we should just enjoy our own folly because it actually is our own, not somebody else's. Anyway, the question is, what do we expect of audiences? What do we know of them? What do audiences expect of themselves? What do they know of themselves? How do you conjugate all the different terms here in a way that gets the most that is positive from the most people who have, for whatever odd and sometimes completely vague to themselves reasons, decided to enter into the crowd? How do you treat crowds with respect, in other words? And how do you belong to them respectful of your own peculiarities, and you perhaps are not the perfect example of what an artist, an art lover should be. You're just one kind of art lover mixed into a lot of other art lovers. I like to talk about people with taste as opposed to people with appetite. I've noticed that many people with the best taste have very small appetites. People with big appetites tend to consume more, true, and maybe they only do it with their eyes, but they also tend to be interested in more. The people with big appetites are much more willing to sample things that are unfamiliar. People with taste tend to get really tied up in knots about the perfect example of the thing they already know. Taste in general is a conservative factor. It's very good when you are trying to discern the validity or the connoisseurship status of an individual object in a class of objects that you have studied and tasted a lot. But if you have perfect taste in, I don't know, French cooking, doesn't mean you're so good when you have maybe diner food or something else. And if you don't know the difference between good and bad diner food, that's a good test of taste. Now, called diner food pop art.